What's up, everyone? I'm Trey Baird. Let's walk and talk. So this week is Cold Burn Week at Swollen Thumb Entertainment. We are celebrating the holiday season of 2017, and if you didn't know, now you know. We have all sorts of things planned for this celebration of the holiday season this year. This is just the tip of the iceberg. You might be wondering what I mean in the first place by cold burn. What the heck is that? See, I wanted to start the season off with a little bit of a talking point. You know, we're going to get into the more hardcore horror later on in the season, but I wanted to start something off with a talking point, something intriguing. I've already gone over this in a previous video, but like I said in that video, some people consider this to be family-friendly horror, and I think that falls short of the real truth. A lot of what I refer to as cold burn horror does fall into the family-friendly category, but that's not really what defines it. To me, cold burn is more of a regular story that has horror themes, or a horror movie that has horror themes but doesn't go full on fright or terrifying mode. With that said, let's get into my top 9 picks for best cold burn horror movies ever. Warning, a few of these entries are pretty controversial. Halloween 3. So yeah, we're starting this list off controversial right from the jump. This just shows my tendency to go against the grain and be rebellious, because most people consider Halloween 3 to be the weakest of the series. In my case, it's one of my favorites. I'm not sure I like it more than the original, but I certainly like it more than most of the other entries in the series, especially the further along the series got. The problem is, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, is that the first movie dealt with Michael Myers, and the second movie dealt with Michael Myers, and the fourth movie dealt with Michael Myers. The third movie doesn't have Michael Myers at all, and that's where a lot of people take issue with it. If it had been called something else, people might have been more receptive to it, which at the end of the day is a marketing decision. And do we really need to hold marketing, against a movie that might otherwise be acceptable? I mean, my favorite Star Wars movie is the original Star Wars Episode 4, but the original version before all that extra stuff was added to it. The 1977 version. I love it. And I'm able to go into it, as an alternate universe, thinking that this is a standalone film, which is what it was meant to be. So if I can do that, I can also look at Halloween 3 as its own thing without judging it based on the other films in the series. And when I do that, I see a film that dared to do something a little different, which was especially ballsy when you consider that it broke the routine that was established in the first 2 movies. And that whole jingle, 3 more days till Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. That should be a classic film moment that was robbed of the opportunity to become classic because of people's bias, prejudice against the movie in general. And without going into spoiler territory, this film should only get better with age, as people's paranoia about big corporations and conspiracy theories continue to grow. This film really deserves a second chance if you dismissed it in the past. Number 8, Final Destination. So here we go, a little less controversial subject, although I know a lot of people who wouldn't consider this to be a horror movie at all. It's not horror, it's psychological thriller. There's a big difference. Sure, there's a big difference. Semantic petty nonsense. The movie goes into concepts such as our mortality and destination, and how much control we actually have in the universe. I think these are pretty heavy concepts, presented in a way to horrify. In my opinion, that falls cleanly into the category of horror. If you disagree, you might want to stop watching now, because the talking points only get more controversial from here on. The movie was so popular that it spawned a few sequels, and even gave rise to the whole psychological horror genre. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the big psychological thrillers, I should say, that really catapulted the genre back into the mainstream. I mean, in my opinion, that was a cool idea. The idea that all of these people narrowly avoided missing death, but you can't escape death, and death is going to come back for you. They say that nothing is original, but I haven't really seen that idea being done too much before that. So I thought it was a breath of fresh air. And even though it's cliche now, it certainly wasn't at the time. Personally speaking, I have lots of movies that under the psychological thriller genre that I like more, but I can't deny the influence that this movie has, which is why it is my number 8 pick. Number 7, Zombieland. Okay, so what we have here is a case of identity crisis. Is it a comedy? Is it a horror? I mean, what is it? Which one does it lean more so in the direction of? In my opinion, the identity crisis of Zombieland is part of what gives it personality. That's where the charm lies. The comedy sets you into a false sense of security, and when they do delve into the horror aspects, it comes a little unexpected. But every role in this film, I can't see anyone else doing. It's just so perfectly cast. And including the cameo, which if you're one of the few people who hasn't had this spoiled or hasn't seen it, I'm not going to spoil it for you now. I just strongly encourage you to go watch it because you're in for a treat. Out of all of the 9 movies on this list, though, this was the one that I had the most difficulty classifying as cold burn. Here's my reasoning, though. I can't legitimately call it a horror movie, but I also don't feel good calling it a comedy. But it certainly does have some heavy concepts with the intention to horrify, but that's not the primary focus of the film. It's a mostly lighthearted film with some heavy subjects and a few scenes that I consider downright scary. Add on to that, not counting any of that, it's also an exceptional movie, and that is why I have it as my number 7 pick. Number 6, A Nightmare Before Christmas. You might be surprised I didn't rank this higher than I did. As I stated in a previous video, I'm not a huge fan of Tim Burton, and even though I know that Tim Burton didn't have a whole lot to do with this film, which is part of the reason I like it in the first place, it still is obviously inspired by his style. Can't deny the creativity involved, though. All of the characters just pop off of the screen. I remember when they were doing the action figures for this film, and you can't deny the creativity. It's just so awesome the way they did everything. And the music is memorable to this day. If there is such a thing as a Halloween carol, like a Christmas carol, then "This is Halloween, this is Halloween" would be one of the more popular ones. And as I've said before, I consider Halloween to be a part of the holiday season, including the build-up to Halloween. So for this film to include both of the major holidays of the holiday season, Halloween and Christmas, in such an inspired way, that alone gives it brownie points for me. It's also a good movie and very creative, as I said, not counting any of that, so it deserves a spot on the list. A lot of people would put it at number 1. I don't. Number 5, Ghostbusters. Okay, so here we go again with another movie that deserves to be on the list, then for no other reason than the culture that it has inspired. Simply put, Ghostbusters is an American film classic, and if you haven't seen it, you need to stop what you're doing and go see it now. Having grown up in the early 90s, late 80s, I can tell you that Ghostbusters was like one of the coolest things to come around. And as a kid, it was hard to explain why that is. As an adult, it's not much easier. I mean, if you were to read a synopsis of the film, it's about, a business enterprise that traps ghosts. I mean, it's kind of hard to understand why it became such a lightning in a bottle phenomenon that it did. Once again, a good part of it was the casting. You know, the actors are what made this film. Their own personality, they just burst off of the screen, and the way they play off of each other is just brilliant. And like pretty much every classic film I can think of, it has a killer soundtrack, and it just reeks of the 80s, and that's part of what gives it its charm. So if you have a aversion towards anything 80s related, you know, this film might not be for you, but I encourage you to rethink that, because this film needs to be for everyone. I mean, what else can I say about the film that hasn't been said already? I mean, it's just a damn good movie, and if you haven't seen it, you're doing yourself a great disservice. Number 4, Lord of the Rings. So here we are. We're getting into some of the more controversial things. First of all, why is it above Ghostbusters and Nightmare Before Christmas? Second of all, why are you calling it a horror movie? Let me just state up front, I don't consider Lord of the Rings to be horror, but the director Peter Jackson wears his horror roots and influence on his sleeve. To say that it doesn't have horror themes in the film would be a straight up lie. I mean, especially the scenes that involve the ring and the influence it has on the wearer. I mean, there's a lot of horror influence there, and I can't deny that. And the thing is, the horror themes never really let up. They continue going and going all the way through the 3 films, which is part of the reason I classified the whole thing as one entry. You know, I couldn't single out one movie for being more horror themed than the other, even though Fellowship does have quite a bit of it. I'm not going to go into these themes individually, you know, but just in case you don't see them, I think this would be a good topic for a later video, because I would be spending a lot of time talking about why I consider Lord of the Rings to be influenced by horror. As for its placement on the list, what can I say? It just speaks to me more than the movies that preceded this entry. Your mileage will definitely vary. To be honest with you, it would probably be number 1 on my list, but there were a few missteps in the filmmaking process, such as having way too much comic relief in the second film, and I just don't care for the CG Gollum. I just don't. I recognize the artistry involved, but it pulls me out of the experience. If it wasn't for these 2 things, Lord of the Rings would be one of my favorite films of all time. Number 3, Let the Right One In. Now, this film was remade as an American film called Let Me In. That's a dang good movie too. But I'm not referring to the remake, I'm referring to the original film that's not even in English. You know, I don't get hung up on labels too much for anything, because I feel that when you're hung up on labels, you're kind of missing the experience of things. But I don't really consider this film to be horror at all. To me, it's more like a supernatural love story. And I haven't seen it in a year or 2, so I don't remember, but I don't think there's any downright scary scenes in the film, but there were a few scenes that genuinely creeped me out, like very unsettling stuff. I can't properly talk about this film without getting slightly spoilery, so just here we go, but just be aware that I'm not giving you all the details. It's basically a love story between 2 adolescent kids, you know, a young teenager-ish age. One of them, the girl, is a vampire, and she's not a kid, even though she looks like it because of, you know, being a vampire. She remains eternally young. Her current significant other is getting on in age, and it's time for a new one. So she meets a new young kid who is ostracized by the rest of his peers and picked on, bullied if you will. So we explore concepts as to what is an appropriate relationship. When does an age gap become a big deal? And if one of the 2 people don't appear to be older than the other, is that, you know, what kind of questions does that raise? And every time in the film he refers to her as a girl, she corrects him that she's not a girl. And once you watch this film, that line becomes much more powerful. The way that she helps this young boy out by, dealing with his bullies is just so heartwarming. But it's also a very unsettling story that raises a lot of interesting talking points, which is why I picked it as my number 3 film. Number 2, Donnie Darko. Okay, now we're getting into personal territory for me. We're referring to the original cut, not the director's cut. It's one of my favorite films of all time. I got into this film shortly after it came out on DVD. What drew me in was the visuals and the sound design. It really was something like an acid trip gone horribly wrong. And that kind of thing appeals to me because it reminds me of the type of thing that Walt Disney used to do back in the day. That got me hooked, but what kept me was the themes of the film, the writing, and the concepts that they bring forward. And at the end of the day, they leave more questions unanswered than what they answer. This is what they went back and corrected in the director's cut. In my opinion, a director's cut is a nice, okay film, but by over-explaining the things in this film, they completely destroy what they created in the first. I mean, a director's cut just drags. It goes so slow because they have to explain every little thing, and they put back almost all of the deleted scenes. And the original version is just much more concise, and it gets to the point when it needs to. I mean, it's not an attention span thing. I just talked about Lord of the Rings before this, which are some of the longest modern blockbusters you can find. I love things such as the overly simplified fear and love paradigm that they talk about. At first glance, it is meant to be mocked as just an oversimplified bunch of nonsense, dogmatic, pedantic stuff that people like these teachers cling on to. But when you go back and look at the bigger themes of the film, you realize that it's a message that Donnie needs to hear. He needs to move away from fear and move back towards love. And that is how he's going to close the cycle and save the world from certain destruction, which I think is a good message for humanity in general. Move away from fear and move towards love. Yes, that message can be oversimplified and misused, but it does have its place. Aside from all of that, it's a genuinely entertaining film, and I consider it to be, even though it has a cult following, I consider it to be an underappreciated American classic, and everyone should see it, which is why it's my number 2 pick. Number 1, Coraline. Oh man, this is such a great film. Like, great film, period. That's all I need to say. Everything else is just getting to the nitty-gritty. This film was also obviously inspired by Tim Burton, but it's more creative than what he would have done. Come to think of it, I believe a lot of people already think that it is a Tim Burton movie, but it's not. I mean, the film flirts with horror themes to the point that if it had any more than it does, it would be a full-on horror movie. And it's a children's movie. It's what I love about it. Another thing, the setting of the film is very small. The whole thing takes place in and around her home. And the list of characters is small. It's only her family and a couple of friends. But that's where the magic happens. You get to see different versions of each character, and it kind of plays in the whole duality of human nature in general. We all have our public face and we all have our secret face, our private face, if you will. And that may not have been the filmmaker's intentions at all, but it's kind of what I took away from it. I mean, everything about this film is expertly done. The design, the sound design, the soundtrack, the ideas that they bring forward, the talking points that these ideas have, it's all brilliant. I wish that this film had existed when I was a kid. It would have been one of my favorite movies, if not my favorite movie. It's sort of like a modern day Alice in Wonderland, and criminally underrated as far as I'm concerned. But everyone knows about it, and a lot of people have seen it, and it's still criminally underrated. That's why it's my #1 pick for Cold Burn movies. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, I will catch you guys later. Thank you for watching.